The harsh wind cut through the valley like a blade of ice, carrying with it the scent of approaching snow and something else, fear. Nala pressed her back against the rough bark of an ancient oak, her chest heaving as she tried to control her breathing. Her thick matted hair clung to her face, damp with sweat despite the bitter cold. The heavy brow ridge that shadowed her dark eyes gave her face a primitive strength, but now those eyes were wide with terror. Behind her, nestled in the crude sling made of mammoth hide, little Zara whimpered softly. The orphaned child, barely 3 seasons old, had been with Nala since her own band was scattered by sickness 2 moons ago. Zara's tiny hands clutched at the fur wrapping, her small face bearing the same heavy features of their kind, the broad nose, the prominent jaw, the thick bones that marked them as children of the Ice Age. The sound of breaking branches echoed through the forest. They were still coming. Nala peered around the tree trunk and saw them. Grak and Voss, 2 massive brutes from the mountain band. Their hulking frames moved through the undergrowth with surprising stealth for creatures of their size. Grak, the larger of the 2, bore deep scars across his chest from countless battles. His thick arms swung as he walked, knuckles nearly dragging on the frozen ground. Voss was leaner but no less dangerous, his yellowish teeth bared in a perpetual snarl that spoke of cruelty rather than mere hunger. "Find her scent," Grak's guttural voice carried on the wind. "The female cannot have gone far with the cub." Nala's grip tightened on the sharp stone she carried, her only weapon. She had fashioned it herself, chipping away at flint until it formed a crude but deadly point. It would have to be enough if they found her, though she knew it would barely wound creatures like these. The memory of what had brought her to this desperate flight flashed through her mind. Her own band's hunting grounds had been invaded by Grak's group 3 days ago. When she had refused Grak's brutal advances, when she had dared to stand up to him in front of the others, he had marked her as his prey. The chase had begun at dawn, and now the sun was setting on her 2nd day of running. Little Zara stirred in the sling, and Nala quickly placed a gentle hand over the child's mouth. "Quiet, little one," she whispered in their primitive tongue, the words more grunt and gesture than speech. "We must be like the shadow cat now, silent, still." The child's large, trusting eyes looked up at her. Despite everything, Zara had never cried during their flight. It was as if the little one understood that their very lives depended on silence. A branch snapped closer than before, too close. Nala's muscles tensed as she prepared to run again, but her legs ached from days of constant movement. Her feet were raw and bleeding inside her crude bark coverings. She had eaten nothing but a few bitter roots since the chase began, and her strength was nearly spent. "Her tracks lead this way," Voss called out, his voice thick with cruel anticipation. "The soft ground near the stream holds her footprints well." The stream. Nala's heart sank. In her desperation to find water for Zara, she had made a fatal mistake. The muddy banks would show exactly where they had crossed, which direction they had gone. She looked around frantically for another escape route, but the terrain offered little hope. To her left lay a steep ravine filled with sharp rocks. To her right, the forest thinned into open ground where they would be easily spotted. Ahead, the stream curved around a bend, but beyond that lay unknown territory. The sound of heavy footsteps grew louder. Through the trees, she could see Grak's massive silhouette moving steadily in her direction. His broad shoulders pushed through the undergrowth like a moving boulder, unstoppable and relentless. Nala closed her eyes and pressed her face against Zara's soft hair. The child smelled of innocence and warmth, of a future that might never come to pass. She had promised Zara's dying mother that she would protect the little one, would raise her as her own, but how could she keep that promise when she could barely protect herself? A low growl echoed through the forest, not from her pursuers, but from somewhere ahead. Nala's eyes snapped open. Another threat? Or perhaps an opportunity? The growling came again, deeper and more menacing. Whatever creature lurked ahead was large and dangerous. But danger could sometimes be an ally if one was desperate enough to embrace it. Nala made her choice. Better to face an unknown predator than the certain brutality of Grak and Voss. She adjusted Zara's sling, whispered a silent prayer to the ancestors, and crept forward toward the source of the growling. Behind her, the voices of her hunters grew closer. "The trail is fresh here," Grak's voice boomed. "She moves like a wounded deer now. Soon we will have her." Nala pushed through a thicket of thorny bushes, ignoring the way they tore at her already tattered hide clothing. Blood seeped from new cuts on her arms, but she felt nothing except the driving need to keep Zara safe. The growling stopped suddenly. In the eerie silence that followed, Nala realized she could no longer hear her own heartbeat over the rushing of her blood. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but there was nowhere left to go. She emerged from the thicket into a small clearing, and her breath caught in her throat. There, silhouetted against the dying light of the sun, stood the largest male she had ever seen. Krog stood motionless in the center of the clearing, his massive frame carved from shadows and dying sunlight. He was larger than any hunter Nala had ever encountered, his shoulders broader than two normal males, his arms thick as tree branches. The heavy ridge above his eyes cast his face in darkness, but she could see the glint of intelligence in his deep-set gaze as he studied her with the careful attention of a predator evaluating potential prey. His chest rose and fell with controlled breathing, each exhale visible in the cold air. Crude scars crisscrossed his torso, telling stories of battles with creatures both human and beast. Around his waist hung a collection of tools and weapons that spoke of a skilled hunter: stone axes, bone knives, and what appeared to be the curved tusk of a massive boar. For a long moment, neither moved. Nala clutched her flint blade, knowing it would be useless against such a giant, while Zara remained perfectly still against her back. The child seemed to sense the danger, her small body tense with the same primitive awareness that had kept their kind alive for countless generations. Krog's nostrils flared as he caught their scent, and his head tilted slightly. When he spoke, his voice was deep and measured, like distant thunder rolling across the mountains. "You carry fear scent, female, and blood." His eyes moved to the cuts on her arms, then to the sling on her back. "The small one is not yours." Nala's grip tightened on her weapon, but she forced herself to stand straighter. Even in her desperation, she would not cower. "The child is mine to protect," she replied, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that weighed on every word. A sound crashed through the forest behind her, Grak's voice bellowing in frustration as he lost the trail in the thorny undergrowth. The noise made Nala flinch, but Krog's expression barely changed. Only a slight narrowing of his eyes suggested he had registered the threat. "How you were hunted," he observed, stating the obvious with the same calm tone one might use to comment on the weather. "Two males from the mountain band," Nala admitted, seeing no point in deception. "They seek to claim what is not theirs." Krog's massive head turned toward the sound of approaching pursuers, and for the first time Nala saw something shift in his demeanor. The muscles in his jaw tightened, and his hands moved unconsciously to the weapons at his belt. "Grak," he said, and the single word carried a weight of history. Nala's eyes widened. "You know him?" "We have met." Krog's response was terse, but the scars on his chest seemed to throb with old pain. "He took something from my band during the last harsh season. My sister." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "She did not survive his attentions." The crashing grew louder as Grak and Voss fought through the thorny barrier. Soon they would break through into the clearing. Nala looked around desperately, but there was nowhere to run. The open space offered no cover, and Krog blocked the only other path out. "Please," she whispered, hating herself for the pleading tone, but unable to stop it. "The child is innocent. If you must choose a side." Krog studied her face for what felt like an eternity. Behind his heavy brow, she could see calculations being made, old wounds being weighed against present dangers. Finally, he stepped aside and gestured toward a barely visible gap between two massive boulders. "There," he rumbled. "A cave, deep and narrow. Take the child inside and do not come out until I call for you." Nala hesitated. "What will you do?" For the first time, something that might have been a smile crossed Krog's brutish features. It was not a pleasant expression. "I will remind them why this territory has an owner." The sound of splintering wood announced that her pursuers had nearly broken through. Nala made her choice and ran toward the cave entrance, Zara bouncing gently against her back. The gap between the rocks was so narrow she had to turn sideways to squeeze through, but inside the space opened into a natural chamber, large enough for several people. The cave smelled of wood smoke and cooked meat. Someone's home. Primitive tools lined the walls, and sleeping furs were arranged near a cold fire pit. This was Krog's territory, his sanctuary, and he was about to defend it. From outside came the crash of bodies breaking through the final barrier of thorns, followed by Grak's triumphant bellow. "The scent trail ends here, female. Come out and face what you have earned." Nala pressed herself against the cave wall, one hand protectively cradling Zara. Through the narrow opening, she could see Krog standing exactly where she had left him, his massive form silhouetted against the fading light. He made no move to hide or seek advantage. He simply waited. "Grak," Krog's voice cut through the evening air like a blade. "You trespass." There was a moment of shocked silence before Grak's laughter echoed through the clearing. "Krog the solitary. I should have known. This territory grows too small for both of us, brother." "We are not brothers," Krog replied calmly. "Brothers do not defile innocence." "The female fled from us," Voss interjected, his voice high and nasal. "She owes a debt that must be paid." Krog's head swiveled toward the smaller hunter with predatory focus. "You speak of debts, Voss the coward. Your debt to me remains unpaid. The antler spear you stole during the mammoth hunt. The dried meat you took from my cache. The lies you told about my hunting grounds." Nala heard the sound of stone scraping against stone, weapons being drawn. The confrontation had moved beyond words. "Stand aside, Krog," Grak commanded, his voice losing its mocking tone. "The female and her whelp are ours by right of pursuit. Do not die for strangers." "I do not die easily," Krog replied. "You should remember this." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Nala found herself holding her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. Little Zara stirred in the sling, and Nala quickly offered the child her finger to suckle, keeping her quiet and calm. Then Grak roared, a sound of pure rage and bloodlust that sent chills down Nala's spine. The battle had begun. Through the cave opening, she could see flashes of movement as the three giants clashed in combat that would determine not just her fate, but the future of the small life she carried. The sound of bone meeting flesh echoed through the clearing like thunder. From her hiding place, Nala could see only fragments of the battle, a massive fist connecting with Grak's jaw, the flash of a stone blade cutting through the air, the spray of blood across the dirt. Krog fought like the mountain predators of old, using his superior size to drive wedges between his two opponents. When Voss lunged forward with his bone spear, Krog caught the weapon's shaft and twisted, the crack of breaking wood sharp in the cold air. Voss screamed as the splintered end drove back into his own shoulder, sending him stumbling backward into the thorny undergrowth. But Grak was a different kind of fighter, older, more experienced, and fueled by a rage that matched Krog's own. The scarred hunter circled his opponent like a wolf, his crude axe weaving hypnotic patterns as he sought an opening. "Still protecting weaklings, Krog?" Grak taunted as he feinted left, then struck right. The stone blade caught Krog across the ribs, opening a line of bright blood. "Your sister cried for you before the end, called your name as I—" Krog's roar cut off the cruel words. He launched himself forward with such force that both hunters crashed to the ground, rolling and grappling in the dirt. His massive hands closed around Grak's throat, but the smaller male managed to drive a knee into Krog's stomach, forcing him to release his grip. Little Zara whimpered softly, and Nala quickly adjusted the sling, pulling the child closer to her chest. Through the chaos outside, she could hear Voss recovering from his wound, his labored breathing gradually steadying as he prepared to rejoin the fight. The two main combatants regained their feet almost simultaneously. Grak's neck bore the purple impressions of Krog's fingers, but his eyes blazed with undiminished fury. Krog bled from multiple small cuts, none serious but all contributing to his gradual weakening. "2 against 1 was always your way," Krog observed, wiping blood from his mouth. "Even as children, you needed others to fight your battles." "Survival requires allies," Grak spat back. "You chose solitude, you chose weakness." This time it was Voss who attacked first, having pulled the splintered spear from his shoulder and fashioned it into a shorter stabbing weapon. He came at Krog's back while the giant was focused on Grak, but Krog's hearing was acute. Without turning around, he stepped aside and backhanded Voss across the face with enough force to send him sprawling. The motion left Krog exposed to Grak's counterattack. The scarred hunter's axe found its mark, biting deep into Krog's left shoulder. Blood flowed freely now, staining the giant's chest and weakening his arm. But instead of retreating, Krog stepped closer, trapping the axe handle between his body and his opponent's arm. What followed was a display of raw brutality that made Nala close her eyes. The wet sounds of flesh being torn, the grunts and gasps of men pushing their bodies beyond normal limits, the crack of bones under pressure. When she dared to look again, both fighters were on the ground, but only Krog was moving. Grak lay motionless, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle. Voss crawled away through the undergrowth, leaving a trail of blood and broken sounds behind him. He would not be returning to finish this fight. Krog rose slowly to his feet, swaying slightly from blood loss. His left arm hung useless at his side, and deep gashes crisscrossed his torso. but he was alive and his enemies were not. "It is finished," he called toward the cave, his voice hoarse but steady. "You may come out." Nala emerged from the narrow opening, still carrying Zara in her sling. The clearing looked like a slaughter ground, churned earth mixed with blood, broken weapons scattered about, and Grak's still form lying in the center of it all. Krog looked at her with eyes that seemed older than they had just moments before. "You are safe now," he said simply. But even as he spoke the words, they both knew they were not entirely true. Voss had escaped, wounded, but alive. He would return to his mountain band with tales of what had transpired here. Others would come, seeking revenge or simply drawn by the scent of weakness. Nala approached Krog carefully, studying his wounds with the eye of someone who had tended injuries before. "You need healing," she said. "The cuts are deep. I have survived worse." But his voice lacked conviction, and she could see the way he favored his injured side. "The child and I have nowhere else to go," Nala said quietly. "If you would permit it, I know the healing herbs that grow in these valleys. I could tend your wounds in exchange for shelter." Krog studied her face for a long moment, and she wondered what he saw there. A burden? A responsibility he had not asked for? Or perhaps something else? A chance to fill the emptiness that his solitary life had carved inside him. "The cave is large enough," he said finally. "The child will need warmth as the cold season deepens." It was not a declaration of love or protection, merely a practical acknowledgement of circumstances. But as Nala looked into his weathered face, she saw something that gave her hope. Krog the Solitary was not as alone as he pretended to be. In her arms, little Zara reached out toward the giant male with tiny, trusting fingers, and for just a moment, something soft flickered in Krog's hard eyes as he looked down at the orphaned child who had already lost so much. The wind picked up, carrying the promise of snow and the distant howl of predators beginning their nightly hunt. But for the first time in days, Nala did not feel afraid. She had found something precious in this violent clearing, not just safety, but the possibility of family. Behind them, Grak's body grew cold in the gathering dusk, a reminder that their peace had been bought with blood and would need to be defended again. Inside the cave, firelight danced across stone walls worn smooth by countless seasons of wind and rain. Nala had rekindled Krog's fire, using the ancient methods her grandmother had taught her. Dried grass and bark shavings coaxed into flame with patient breath and steady hands. The warmth felt like a blessing after so many nights sleeping in the open. Krog sat heavily on a pile of mammoth furs, his massive frame dwarfing the makeshift bed. The battle had taken more from him than he cared to admit. His left shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and the smaller cuts across his chest and arms burned like brands in the firelight. "Remove the hide covering," Nala instructed, setting little Zara down on a soft bearskin near the fire. The child immediately began exploring her new surroundings with the fearless curiosity of the very young, her tiny hands patting at the fur and reaching toward the dancing flames. Krog hesitated. In his solitary life, he had grown unused to the touch of others, to the vulnerability that came with allowing someone to tend his wounds. But the bleeding had not stopped, and he could feel his strength ebbing with each passing moment. With careful movements, he peeled away the blood-soaked animal skin that covered his torso. The wounds looked worse in the firelight, deep gashes that would need more than time to heal properly. Without treatment, the flesh would fester and rot, and he would die slowly and painfully. Nala studied the injuries with the practiced eye of one who had seen violence before. From a small pouch made of woven grass, she withdrew various dried plants and roots she had gathered during her flight through the forest. Her knowledge of healing herbs was one of the few gifts her harsh life had provided. "This will sting," she warned, crushing bitter leaves between her palms to release their essence. "But it will draw out the poison that evil wounds carry." The first touch of the herbal paste against his torn flesh made Krog grunt involuntarily. The medicine burned like ice and fire combined, but beneath the pain he could feel its healing power working. Nala's hands moved with surprising gentleness, her thick fingers surprisingly delicate as they cleaned and dressed each wound. "Where did you learn such skills?" he asked, partly to distract himself from the discomfort. "My grandmother was the healer for our band," Nala replied, not looking up from her work. "She said the spirits spoke to her through the plants, told her which ones would heal and which would harm. I think the spirits were simply her knowledge, passed down from mother to daughter for countless generations." Krog watched her face as she worked, noting the concentration in her dark eyes, the way her heavy brow furrowed when she encountered a particularly deep cut. There was something soothing about her presence, a calmness that he had not experienced since his sister's death. "What happened to your band?" he asked quietly. Nala's hands stilled for a moment before continuing their work. "Sickness," she said simply. "It came with the early cold before we could gather enough food for the harsh season. First the old ones, then the young, then the hunters. In the end, only I remained, and Zara." "The child's parents?" "Her mother was my closest friend. She made me promise to protect the little one, to raise her as my own blood." Nala glanced toward where Zara sat, contentedly chewing on a piece of soft leather. It was an easy promise to make, harder to keep. Krog understood. In their world, promises to the dying were sacred bonds that could not be broken, even at the cost of one's own life. That Nala had risked everything to honor such a vow spoke to a strength of character that impressed him. "And before Grak began hunting you?" he pressed gently. Nala's jaw tightened as she applied medicine to the axe wound on his shoulder. "We sought shelter with other bands, but none would take in 2 extra mouths during the lean season. Grak's band was the last we approached. He said he would provide for us, but his price was too high." She did not elaborate, but Krog could imagine the terms that had been offered. Males like Grak saw females as possessions to be claimed and used, not as companions to be cherished. That Nala had refused, knowing the consequences, showed a courage that matched any hunter's. "You fought well today," Nala said, changing the subject as she began wrapping his wounds with strips of soft hide. "But Voss escaped. He will bring others." Krog nodded grimly. "The mountain band numbers more than 20. They will seek revenge for Grak's death, and they will want to reclaim you. This territory will not be safe." "Then we must leave," Nala said practically. "Where would we go? Winter approaches, and the child is too small for long journeys. We would die in the cold before finding new shelter." The truth of his words settled between them like a stone. They were trapped between the approaching winter and the certainty of revenge. The cave that had seemed like salvation was now a prison. Little Zara crawled closer to the adults, drawn by the warmth of the fire and the sound of their voices. She pulled herself up against Krog's leg, her small hands gripping his knee as she looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. Something shifted in the giant's expression as he looked down at the child. His uninjured hand moved almost involuntarily to touch her soft hair, his thick fingers surprisingly gentle against her small head. "She is not afraid of me," he observed with wonder. "Children see truth more clearly than adults," Nala replied. "She knows you are a protector, not a threat." Zara babbled something in her infant language and reached up toward Krog's face. Without thinking, he leaned down so she could touch his cheek, her tiny palm barely covering one of his old scars. "Perhaps there is another way," Krog said slowly, his voice thoughtful. "The mountain band will come, yes, but they will expect to find us weak and defenseless. They do not know that I have defeated their strongest hunter." Nala paused in her bandaging. "What are you thinking?" "That predators respect only strength," Krog replied, his eyes reflecting the firelight like those of some great hunting cat. "If we cannot run, then we must make them fear to approach." In the dancing shadows of the cave, a plan began to take shape, dangerous and desperate, but perhaps their only chance for survival. Dawn broke grey and cold over the valley, painting the world in shades of ice and shadow. Krog stood at the mouth of his cave, testing the movement of his injured shoulder. 3 days had passed since the battle with Grak, and Nala's healing herbs had worked their magic. The wounds still ached, but the strength was returning to his arm. Below in the clearing, Grak's body had been dragged away by scavengers during the night, wolves and carrion birds that left only scattered bones and bloodstains to mark where the fight had taken place. It was as if the earth itself sought to erase the violence, but Krog knew that memories lasted longer than flesh. "They will come today," he said, without turning around. Behind him in the cave, Nala was preparing the morning meal, dried meat softened in hot water, mixed with ground nuts and bitter roots. Little Zara sat nearby, playing with a collection of smooth stones that clicked pleasantly when she banged them together. "How can you be certain?" Nala asked, though her voice carried no real doubt. She had learned to trust Krog's instincts over the past few days. Voss will have reached them yesterday. They needed time to gather their hunters, to plan their approach, but they will not wait longer. Each day gives us more time to prepare, more chance to escape. He flexed his fingers, watching the play of tendons beneath scarred skin. "They know this as well as I do." Nala set down her cooking implements and joined him at the cave entrance. The valley below looked peaceful in the morning light, but she had learned to see beneath such deceptions. The absence of bird calls, the way the small creatures stayed hidden in their burrows, the subtle wrongness in the air that spoke of predators moving unseen. "Tell me the plan again," she said. Krog pointed to various features of the landscape as he spoke. "The path up to the cave is narrow, room for only 2 to climb abreast. They will send their strongest hunters first, leaving the weaker ones to follow. Here," he indicated a cluster of large boulders, "we create the first delay." Rocks balance to fall when disturbed, blocking the path and separating their force. And then, the second trap lies there, where the path curves around the cliff face. Sharp stakes hidden in the shadows, angled upward. Any who rush forward in anger will impale themselves. Nala studied the terrain with new eyes, seeing how the natural features could be turned into weapons. What of those who survive both traps? They will be few, tired and demoralized. Then we face them with the advantage of position and preparation. Krog's smile was grim, and with the fury of those protecting their young. The plan was sound but dangerous. Everything depended on timing, on their enemies reacting as expected, on no unforeseen complications. In their harsh world, plans often crumbled at first contact with reality. "I should take Zara deeper into the cave," Nala said. "Find a hiding place where—" "No," Krog's voice was firm. "We fight together or we die together. The child will be safer with both of us to protect her than alone in the darkness." There was wisdom in his words, though Nala's maternal instincts rebelled against exposing Zara to such danger. But they had no good choices, only degrees of risk. They spent the morning completing their preparations. Krog used his massive strength to position the boulder traps, carefully balancing tons of stone so they would tumble at the slightest disturbance. Nala worked with the patience of a spider, weaving hidden snares from tough grass fibers and positioning sharp stones where unwary feet might step. Little Zara seemed to sense the tension in the air. She stayed closer to the adults than usual, her play more subdued, her large eyes watching everything with the alertness of prey animals. When Nala picked her up to nurse, the child clung more tightly than normal, as if afraid to let go. "She knows," Nala murmured, stroking the small head nestled against her chest. "The young always know," Krog agreed. "It is how they survive to grow old." By midday, the traps were set, and they had retreated to the cave mouth to wait. Krog had armed himself with his best weapons, a massive stone axe that could split a skull with one blow, a long spear with a fire-hardened tip, and a collection of throwing stones selected for weight and balance. Nala carried her sharp flint blade and a sling loaded with rocks, while Zara remained securely bound to her back in the hide carrier. The waiting was the hardest part. Every sound from the valley below made them tense. The call of a distant bird, the rustle of wind through dead leaves, the splash of something moving in the stream. But always it proved to be nothing. "Perhaps they will not come," Nala said hopefully, as the sun reached its peak. Krog shook his head. "They will come. Pride demands it and fear drives them. If they do not destroy us, others will see weakness. Their leadership will be questioned." As if summoned by his words, a new sound drifted up from the valley, the distant rhythm of many feet moving in unison, the low murmur of voices carefully controlled. The mountain band had arrived. Krog and Nala exchanged a look of understanding. The time for preparation was over. Now came the test of whether their desperate plan could save the small family they had formed in the shadow of violence. From her hiding place behind an outcropping of rock, Nala could see them now, dark figures moving through the trees below like shadows given flesh. More than she had expected, perhaps 15 or 20 strong. All males, all armed, all driven by the promise of revenge and the prospect of claiming prizes. "So many," she whispered. "Good," Krog replied, surprising her. "More to fall into our traps, more to fear us when this day is done." In the carrier on Nala's back, little Zara made a soft sound, not quite a cry, but a whisper of distress that spoke to every protective instinct in her guardians' hearts. The battle for their future was about to begin. The mountain band moved up the valley like a dark tide, their crude weapons glinting in the afternoon sun. From her vantage point, Nala could see their leader, a scarred brute nearly as large as Krog, his chest painted with streaks of red clay that marked him as a war chief. Behind him came the others, lean hunters with spears and axes, younger males eager to prove themselves and bringing up the rear, Voss himself, his wounded shoulder wrapped in blood-stained hides. "Break the Bone Crusher leads them," Krog observed, his voice tight with old hatred. "Grak's brother. This explains their numbers. He has united 2 bands for this hunt." Nala's heart sank. Their traps had been designed for perhaps 10 attackers, not 20, but it was too late to change their preparations now. They would have to trust in their planning and hope that fear would accomplish what force could not. The invaders paused at the base of the cliff, studying the narrow path that led up to Krog's cave. Even from a distance, Nala could see them gesturing and pointing, making their own plans. These were not mindless beasts driven by rage alone. They were experienced hunters who understood the value of caution. Brack's voice boomed across the valley, magnified by the rock walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Krog the coward, you hide in your hole like a wounded fox, but we have come to drag you out. Send down the female and the spawn, and perhaps we will let you die quickly." Krog stepped forward to the very edge of the cliff, making himself visible to those below. His massive form cast a long shadow down the rock face as he raised his voice in reply. "I am here, Brack the fool. Come and take what you think you deserve. But know that your brother's bones feed the crows, and yours will join them before the sun sets." The taunt had its intended effect. Several of the younger hunters started forward immediately, their blood heated by the insult to their leader. But Brack raised his hand, stopping them with veteran discipline. "Patience," his voice carried on the wind. "The desperate animal seeks to draw us into hasty attack. We will climb slowly and carefully, taking no unnecessary risks." Krog cursed under his breath. The enemy leader was too experienced to be goaded into recklessness. This would make their task much harder. The ascent began with methodical precision. 4 hunters started up the path in single file, testing each foothold before committing their weight. Behind them, others waited their turn, spears ready to strike at any sign of ambush. "The first trap will not catch them," Nala whispered. "They move too carefully." "Then we make them move less carefully," Krog replied. He hefted one of his throwing stones, judging distance and angle. "When they reach the marker stone, be ready." The marker was a distinctive white rock about halfway up the path, positioned just beyond the first trap. When the lead hunter reached it, Krog's arm whipped forward with devastating force. The stone struck the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him tumbling backward into his companions. The effect was instantaneous chaos. The injured hunter's fall knocked 2 others from the narrow path, their screams echoing off the canyon walls as they plummeted to the rocks below. The 4th hunter, seeing his companions fall, abandoned caution and rushed forward up the path. He ran straight into Krog's carefully balanced boulder trap. The grinding crash of falling stone filled the air as several tons of rock thundered down the cliff face. The rushing hunter disappeared beneath the avalanche, his final cry cut short by the weight of his own impatience. When the dust settled, the path was completely blocked by a wall of rubble. From below came shouts of rage and confusion. Nala could see Brack gesturing angrily, reorganizing his remaining forces. 3 dead in the first moments of battle. Not a promising start to their revenge. "The side path," Krog muttered, studying the terrain below. "They will try to climb the cliff face directly. We need to discourage that approach as well." Sure enough, several hunters were already moving toward a section of rock wall that offered handholds and ledges. It was a more dangerous route than the main path, but it would bypass their traps and bring attackers directly to the cave mouth. Krog gathered an armload of loose stones and began hurling them down with mechanical precision. Each throw was calculated to maximum effect, not necessarily to kill, but to make the climbers hesitate, to plant seeds of doubt in their minds. One hunter, struck in the head by a fist-sized rock, lost his grip and fell screaming. Another managed to dodge the projectiles and continue climbing, but his progress was slow and cautious. Below, Brack roared orders, trying to coordinate multiple approaches simultaneously. "Behind you!" Nala called out suddenly. Krog spun to see a hunter emerging from a narrow cleft in the rock, a hidden approach they had not anticipated. The man was young and lean, armed with a bone spear, his face painted with the red clay of war. He must have been climbing for some time, using stealth rather than speed to reach their position. The young hunter struck without warning, his spear aimed at Krog's back, but Nala's warning had given the giant just enough time to react. He twisted aside, the spear point grazing his ribs instead of piercing his heart, and grabbed the weapon's shaft before his attacker could recover. What followed was brief and brutal. Krog's superior strength allowed him to wrench the spear away and reverse it in a single motion. The young hunter died with a look of surprise on his painted face, his own weapon buried in his chest. "Well fought," Nala said admiringly, but her attention was already turning back to the main battle. More hunters were attempting the cliff face, and others were working to clear the blocked path. Time was running out. Zara whimpered softly from her carrier, disturbed by the sounds of violence and the tension radiating from her guardians. Nala reached back to comfort the child, her touch gentle despite the chaos surrounding them. "How many remain?" she asked. Krog made a quick count of the figures visible below. 15, perhaps 16, too many for direct confrontation. As if to emphasize his point, an arrow whistled past his head. Someone below had produced a crude bow and was taking careful aim. More projectiles followed, forcing both defenders to take cover behind the rocky outcropping. The first phase of the battle was over, and while they had inflicted casualties, the enemy still outnumbered them 4-1. The real test was yet to come. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cliff face as the siege entered its deadliest phase. Krog crouched behind the rocky barrier, an arrow shaft protruding from his already wounded shoulder. Blood seeped through Nala's careful bandages, but his grip on his stone axe remained steady. "They learn too quickly," he growled, peering around the outcropping to assess their enemy's movements. Below, Brack had organized his remaining hunters into coordinated groups, some providing covering fire with crude bows, others working systematically to clear the boulder trap, and a third group attempting the treacherous cliff face climb from multiple angles. Nala adjusted Zara's carrier, ensuring the child remained protected while keeping her own hands free to fight. The little one had grown surprisingly quiet, as if sensing that even the smallest sound could mean death for all of them. "The path will be clear soon," Nala observed, watching the hunters below roll away the smaller stones that blocked their route. "And 3 more climb the east face. We cannot hold all approaches." A whistling sound cut through the air, followed by the sharp crack of flint against stone. Another arrow had found its mark, chipping away at their already limited cover. The archer below was skilled, compensating for distance and wind with the patience of an experienced hunter. Krog made his decision with the swift calculation of someone who had survived countless battles. "Fall back to the cave mouth. We make our stand there." They retreated deeper into the rocky alcove, sacrificing their elevated position for the protection of stone walls on 3 sides. It was a desperate gambit. Once trapped in the cave, they would have nowhere left to run. The sound of falling rocks announced that the path was finally clear. Within moments, the first of their enemies appeared at the cliff top, moving with the careful precision of hunters who had learned to respect their prey. Voss himself led this group, his wounded shoulder bound but his eyes blazing with the promise of revenge. "Finally," he snarled, seeing Krog and Nala pressed back against the cave entrance. The mighty protector reveals himself as just another cornered animal. Behind Voss came 2 more hunters, both armed with spears and bearing the ritual scars of experienced killers. They spread out to prevent any escape attempt, forming a semicircle that would tighten like a noose. But Krog had not exhausted his tricks. As the hunters advanced, he suddenly hurled his stone axe, not at Voss, but at a carefully selected point on the cliff face above their heads. The impact triggered a small avalanche of loose stones that sent the attackers scrambling for cover. In the confusion, Nala struck with her sling, the stone finding its target in one hunter's temple. He dropped without a sound, but the advantage was temporary. More enemies were climbing to the cliff top, and those already present quickly regrouped. Voss circled closer, his spear held low in the stance of an experienced fighter. "Where is your courage now, female? Will you watch the giant die for your worthless hide?" "She will watch you die first," Krog replied, hefting his long spear as he stepped forward to meet the challenge. The 2 males began a deadly dance, each probing for weaknesses in the other's defense. Voss was faster than his injured shoulder suggested, his spear point weaving hypnotic patterns as he sought an opening. But Krog's reach was longer, and his wounded arm seemed stronger than it had any right to be. Behind them, Nala faced her own crisis. The remaining hunter had worked his way around to her flank, cutting off her retreat into the cave. His stone knife gleamed in the fading sunlight as he approached with predatory confidence. "The spawn will make a fine addition to our band," he leered, his eyes fixed on little Zara. "We will raise her to know her proper place." Rage flooded through Nala like fire through dry grass. This male threatened not just her life, but the future of the child she had sworn to protect. Her flint blade seemed to move of its own accord, striking faster than thought, driven by maternal fury that transcended fear. The hunter's confident smile faded as Nala's knife found the gap between his ribs. He staggered backward, surprise replacing cruelty in his eyes, and tumbled over the cliff edge with a final fading scream. But victory came at a price. More hunters were cresting the cliff, and the sound of their approach echoed off the stone walls like approaching thunder. 8, 10, perhaps a dozen strong, more than enough to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. Krog's battle with Voss intensified as both fighters sensed the approaching climax. The wounded leader's spear grazed Krog's cheek, opening a line of blood, but the giant's return thrust punched through leather and hide to find flesh beneath. Voss gasped and staggered, his weapon dropping from nerveless fingers. "For your sister," Krog said quietly, and drove his spear point home. But there was no time to savor the victory. Brake himself appeared at the cliff edge, his massive frame silhouetted against the sky. Behind him came the remainder of his force, desperate now, driven by the need to end this costly siege before darkness fell. "Enough games!" the war chief bellowed. "Rush them! Take the female alive, but kill everything else!" The final assault began with a roar that shook dust from the cave walls. Krog grabbed Nala's hand and pulled her back into the narrow cave mouth, where the stone walls would limit how many enemies could attack at once. "The deep chamber," he gasped, blood running freely from multiple wounds. "If we can reach it!" But they both knew it was too late for retreat. Their enemies were too close, too numerous, and too determined. Behind them lay only darkness and stone. Before them advanced death in the form of painted hunters, drunk on the promise of conquest. Little Zara chose that moment to speak her first clear word, her tiny voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Da-da." Both adults froze, staring at the small face, looking up at Krog with absolute trust. In the child's eyes was something that neither had expected to see again: hope. It was then that Krog made his final choice, the one that would determine whether their desperate stand became a noble death or an impossible victory. Zara's innocent word hung in the air like a spell, transforming something fundamental in Krog's soul. He looked down at the small face gazing up at him with such trust, such absolute faith, and felt a power he had never known before. Not the strength of muscle and bone, but the fierce determination of a father protecting his young. "Da-da," the child repeated, reaching tiny hands toward his blood-streaked face. The charging hunters were only steps away, their weapons raised and their voices raised in victory cries. But in that frozen moment between heartbeats, Krog made a choice that would echo through legends told around distant fires. "Take her deep into the cave," he commanded Nala, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Find the narrowest passage and wait. No matter what you hear, do not come out until dawn." "Krog!" "No," Nala began, but he was already moving. Instead of retreating further into the cave as their enemies expected, Krog charged forward into their midst. His massive form crashed into the leading hunters like a boulder rolling downhill, scattering them with the force of his unexpected attack. His roar echoed off the cliff walls, not the sound of a desperate animal at bay, but the battle cry of a protector who would die before allowing harm to reach his family. The first hunter to recover from his surprise died with Krog's stone knife buried in his throat. The second managed to land a spear thrust that opened a gash along the giant's ribs, but Krog's return blow caved in the man's chest with bone-crushing force. But it was what happened next that transformed the battle from a simple slaughter into something approaching magic. From deeper in the cave came a new sound, not Nala's voice, but the ancient rhythm of the fire song, the chant that their people had used since the dawn of memory to call forth flame from darkness. Somehow, impossibly, she had managed to kindle a torch while keeping Zara safe, and now she emerged from the cave mouth like a spirit of vengeance wreathed in fire. The effect on the attacking hunters was immediate and devastating. Fire was sacred to their kind, the gift that separated them from beasts. To see it wielded as a weapon by a female defending her, Young struck them with superstitious terror that went deeper than mere fear of burning. Nala swept the torch in wide arcs, driving back hunters who could have overwhelmed her with sheer numbers. The flames seemed to dance with a life of their own, casting writhing shadows that made everything appear larger and more threatening than reality. "Witchfire!" one of the hunters screamed, stumbling backward toward the cliff edge. "She calls flame from air!" The word spread through their ranks like poison, undermining their courage and turning disciplined assault into panicked retreat. Several hunters actually fled, choosing to risk the dangerous descent rather than face what they perceived as supernatural power. But Brack the Bone Crusher was made of sterner stuff. The war chief had seen real magic in his time. The northern shamans who could call storms, the fire dancers of the eastern tribes who walked through flames unburned. This was merely clever use of natural forces, impressive but not impossible. "Fools!" he roared at his retreating hunters. "It is only fire. She bleeds like any other female." To prove his point, he hefted his massive war club, a length of hardwood studded with sharp stones, and advanced on Nala despite the flames. His scarred hide bore the marks of many burns, testament to a warrior who had faced fire before and survived. Krog, still grappling with two hunters near the cliff edge, saw the threat and tried to break free, but his enemies clung to him like desperate wolves, knowing that their only chance lay in preventing him from reaching the female's aid. Brack's club swept toward Nala's head in a blow that would have shattered her skull, but she managed to duck at the last instant. The torch in her other hand jabbed forward, its flames licking at the war chief's face. He jerked back with a curse, but his retreat was tactical rather than fearful. "Give me the spawn," he snarled, circling just beyond the torch's reach. "Give her to me, and I will let you live as my woman. Refuse and watch her burn in the flames you think to frighten me with." In the carrier on her back, little Zara had begun to cry. Not the wails of terror, but the steady rhythmic sobbing of a child who sensed her world falling apart. The sound cut through the battle noise like a knife, reaching both Krog and Nala with primal urgency. Something snapped in Nala's mind, not breaking but realigning itself around a single crystalline purpose. She was no longer a refugee fleeing from stronger predators. She was no longer a suppliant begging for protection. She was a mother defending her young, and that made her the most dangerous creature in their harsh world. "You want her?" Nala said, her voice carrying a coldness that made even Brack hesitate. "Then come and take her." She threw the torch directly at his face. Brack caught the burning brand instinctively, but his triumph lasted only seconds. Nala had not thrown the torch as a weapon. She had thrown it as a distraction. While his eyes tracked the flames, her real attack came from below. The sharp flint blade that had served her so well, driven upward with every ounce of strength in her desperate body. The war chief's eyes widened in shock as he looked down at the knife buried to the hilt in his stomach. Blood bubbled from his lips as he tried to speak, but only a wet gurgling emerged. He toppled backward, the torch falling from nerveless fingers to roll harmlessly across the stone. The sight of their leader's death broke the remaining hunters' will completely. Those who could still move fled down the cliff path without looking back, abandoning their wounded and their honor in their haste to escape. The siege was over. Krog stood among the bodies of the fallen, his massive chest heaving with exhaustion and blood loss. Around him lay the evidence of their impossible victory, 8 dead hunters, testament to what determination and desperation could accomplish when survival was the only option. But it was the sound of Zara's laughter that brought tears to his eyes. The child had stopped crying and was now clapping her tiny hands, delighted by the dancing shadows cast by the fallen torch. In her innocent joy, she saw only the end of the frightening noises, the return of safety and warmth. "Dada," she said again, reaching out to Krog with complete trust. And for the first time in his solitary life, Krog understood what it meant to be truly needed. Dawn came slowly to the valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to echo the blood spilled on the cliff top. Krog sat at the cave mouth, his wounds freshly dressed with Nala's healing herbs, watching the sun climb over the distant peaks. The battle was won, but victory had come at a cost that would take time to fully understand. The clearing below bore the scars of siege, scattered bones, broken weapons, and dark stains on the rocks where hunters had fallen. Carrion birds circled overhead, patient as death itself, waiting for the humans to abandon their perch so the feast could begin. Inside the cave, Nala tended the fire that had saved their lives. Little Zara sat nearby, playing contentedly with a collection of colored stones that Krog had gathered for her during his morning patrol of the territory. The child seemed unaffected by the violence of the previous day, her resilience a reminder of how quickly the young adapted to their harsh world. "The survivors reached the valley floor before nightfall," Krog reported, settling his massive frame carefully to avoid aggravating his injuries. "Their trail leads north toward the high passes. They will not return." Nala looked up from her herb preparations, noting the careful way he moved, the fresh bandages wrapped around his torso. "How many wounds this time?" 11 that need attention, 3 that will scar badly." He managed a grim smile. "But none that will kill me, thanks to your skills." She moved to examine his injuries with the practiced efficiency of someone who had become expert in battlefield medicine. The deepest cut ran along his left shoulder, where Brack's war club had found its mark during their final confrontation. It would heal, but the arm would never move quite the same way again. "You fought like the cave bears of legend," she said, as she cleaned and dressed the wound. "I have never seen one male defeat so many." "I was not alone," Krog replied, his eyes finding little Zara. "When she called me, that word, something changed. I understood what I was truly fighting for. The child looked up at the sound of her name, her small face breaking into the radiant smile that had become the center of their world. She had been babbling all morning, practicing new sounds with the determination of one learning to speak. Most were meaningless noise, but occasionally a real word emerged, Mama for Nala, Dada for Krog, and a sound that might have been home when she looked around the cave. "What happens now?" Nala asked, settling beside them with her own collection of wounds to tend. She had not escaped the battle unmarked, scratches from thrown stones, a burn on her arm from handling the torch, bruises from the desperate struggle with Brack. Krog considered the question carefully. Their victory had bought them safety, but it had also isolated them further from other bands. Word would spread about the fate of Brack's hunters, and some would see them as dangerous enemies to be avoided. Others might view them as potential allies worth cultivating, but trust came slowly in their world. "We build," he said finally. "Winter approaches, and we need more than this cave to survive the cold season. Food stores, better weapons, defenses that do not depend on tricks and desperation. And the child? She grows quickly, but she is still so small. She will learn as we all learned, by watching, by doing, by surviving each day until the next." Krog's scarred hand moved to touch Zara's soft hair with infinite gentleness. "But she will learn it with both parents to guide her, not as an orphan struggling alone." The word parents hung between them, heavy with implications they had not yet discussed. Their arrangement had begun as practical necessity, protection offered in exchange for healing skills, two adults sharing resources for mutual benefit. But somewhere between the flight from Grak and the victory over Brack, something deeper had taken root. Nala felt it too, the subtle shift in how they moved around each other, spoke to each other, planned their shared future. She had loved before, in her old band, but that had been the simple passion of youth. This was different, built on respect earned through hardship, trust forged in the crucible of mortal danger. "The others who escaped," she said, changing the subject to safer ground. "Will they warn other bands about us?" "Almost certainly, but fear can be as useful as friendship, if properly managed." Krog gestured toward the valley below, where the remains of their enemies lay scattered. "Let them tell their stories around distant fires. Let them describe the witch female who commands flame, the giant who fights like 10 men, the cursed cave where hunters go to die. And if someone decides to test those stories, then they will learn what Brack learned." His smile was not pleasant. "This territory is ours now, claimed by right of combat and held by strength of arms. Any who dispute that claim will feed the carrion birds." Little Zara crawled closer to the adults, drawn by the warmth of the fire and the comfort of their voices. She pulled herself up against Krog's knee, her tiny hands gripping the thick fur of his leg coverings as she practiced standing. Her progress was remarkable. Already she was stronger and more coordinated than most children her age, shaped by the demands of their dangerous world. "She will be a hunter," Krog observed with satisfaction. "See how she grips with both hands, how she tests her balance? The instincts are already there. Or a healer," Nala countered. "Notice how she watches when I tend wounds, how she sorts the colored stones by type. She has the patience for careful work. Both, perhaps. The world rewards versatility." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their daughter explore her expanding universe of cave and fire and loving guardians. Outside, the wind carried the sense of approaching winter, crisp air and dying leaves, the promise of snow in the high places. Soon they would need to begin the serious work of preparation, gathering food and fuel and materials for the lean months ahead. But for now, in this moment of peace earned through blood and sacrifice, they were content to simply exist. A family formed from desperation and violence, perhaps, but a family nonetheless. In their harsh world, love took whatever form it could find, and grew strong in the most unlikely soil. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows of night and illuminating the path forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. 3 moons had passed since the great battle, and the small family had settled into the rhythm of survival that defined their world. Krog's wounds had healed into raised scars that told stories of courage and sacrifice, while Nala had expanded their cave into a more livable space with alcoves for sleeping and storage areas for their growing cache of winter supplies. Little Zara had grown remarkably during this time. Now able to walk with confidence on her strong little legs, she followed her adoptive parents everywhere, chattering in the mixture of real words and baby sounds that marked a child learning to speak. Her vocabulary expanded daily. Food when hungry, cold when the morning air bit at her skin, pretty when she found something that pleased her young eyes. The cave itself had been transformed from a simple shelter into something approaching a home. Nala's skill with plant fibers had produced woven mats and hanging storage baskets, while Krog's strength had moved large stones to create comfortable seating areas and better defensive positions. The walls bore the marks of their daily life, tool marks where weapons were sharpened, soot stains from the ever-burning fire, small handprints left by Zara's exploring fingers. Their daily routine had become predictable and comforting. Krog would rise before dawn to check their territory for signs of intruders or predators, while Nala tended the fire and prepared the morning meal. After eating, they would work together, gathering food, making tools, teaching Zara the basic skills she would need to survive. Evenings were spent around the fire, sharing the day's experiences and planning for tomorrow's challenges. It was on such an evening, with the first snow of winter beginning to dust the valley floor, that their hard-won peace was shattered. Krog had just returned from setting snares along the game trails when he froze at the cave mouth, his nostrils flaring as he caught a familiar scent on the wind. Blood, fear, and something else, the distinct odor of humans under extreme stress. "Someone approaches," he announced quietly, his hand moving instinctively to his weapons. Wounded, moving carefully, but with purpose. Nala immediately scooped up Zara and retreated to the back of the cave, while Krog positioned himself where he could see the path without being easily spotted from below. They had drilled this response many times, knowing that their victory over Brack's hunters had made them famous in ways that might attract unwanted attention. The figure that eventually appeared at the cliff top was barely recognizable as human. Torn clothing hung in rags from a skeletal frame, and fresh wounds covered every visible inch of skin. But it was the eyes that told the real story, wild with terror and exhaustion, the look of someone who had seen things that would haunt them forever. "Please," the stranger gasped, collapsing to hands and knees at the cave entrance. "Sanctuary, I beg you. The children—" Krog stepped into view, his massive form blocking the cave mouth completely. "Speak quickly. Who are you and what do you flee from?" "Thane, of the river band," the wounded man replied between ragged breaths. "We were attacked 3 days ago. They took everyone who could still move, left the dead to feed the crows." Nala emerged from the shadows, Zara clinging to her hip with wide, frightened eyes. Something in Thane's desperate manner convinced her that this was not deception or trap, but genuine terror seeking refuge. "Who attacked your band?" she asked gently, kneeling beside the collapsed hunter to examine his wounds. "Raiders from the burned lands," Thane whispered, his voice barely audible. "Led by one they call the Blood Hunter, scarred all over, teeth filed to points, takes captives for ritual purposes." Krog's expression darkened. He had heard whispers of such raiders in recent seasons, savage bands from the wastelands to the south, driven by hunger and cruelty rather than the normal motivations of survival. They were said to practice customs that civilized hunters found abhorrent, turning capture into something worse than death. "How many captives did they take?" Nala asked as she began cleaning Thane's wounds with practiced efficiency. 15, maybe 20, all the young ones and the females of breeding age. Tears cut channels through the dirt on his face. "My daughter, my mate, both among them." The implications struck both Krog and Nala simultaneously. If raiders were taking captives from the established bands, their own small family represented an extremely tempting target. A strong hunter, a skilled female, and a healthy child would be prizes worth considerable risk to acquire. "How far behind are they?" Krog demanded. "Half a day, perhaps less. I tried to mislead them, but their tracker is skilled. They will find this place." Krog exchanged a look with Nala that communicated volumes without words. Their cave, which had seemed like an impregnable fortress against Brack's hunters, could easily become a trap if faced with enemies who had no intention of leaving survivors. The narrow entrance that limited how many attackers could approach at once also limited how many defenders could escape. "Can you travel?" Nala asked Thane, though his condition made the answer obvious. I will try, but the children slowed me greatly. I had 4 with me when I started. Lost them all to the cold, the hunger, the fear." Little Zara had been listening to this exchange with the intense concentration that marked her as unusually intelligent for her age. Now she toddled over to Thane and gently patted his arm with one small hand, offering the wordless comfort that children gave instinctively to those in pain. "Pretty man hurt," she said in her clear child's voice. "Mama fix." Despite everything, Thane managed a weak smile at the small gesture of kindness. "Thank you, little star. You remind me of my own daughter." The mention of his captured child brought fresh tears, and with them a renewed sense of urgency. Somewhere out in the growing darkness, the blood hunter and his raiders were following Thane's trail toward their sanctuary. Every moment spent in discussion was a moment closer to discovery. "We have perhaps 4 hours before they arrive," Krog calculated aloud. "Enough time to obscure the trail, set new traps, prepare for siege. Or to run," Nala added quietly. "Take only what we can carry and flee deeper into the mountains." It was the practical choice, the safe choice. But as Krog looked at little Zara playing fearlessly at the feet of a stranger, he knew that running would only delay the inevitable. Raiders like these did not give up easily, and winter was closing in. A chase through the mountains would likely kill them all long before they found new shelter. "We stay," he decided. "This cave has protected us before. It will do so again." But even as he spoke the words, Krog could not shake the feeling that this enemy would be different from any they had faced before, more dangerous, more determined, and far more cruel than simple hunters seeking revenge. In the distance, a wolf howled, or perhaps it was something else entirely, something that should not be making sounds in the civilized darkness. The raiders came with the false dawn, moving through the pre-sunrise darkness like shadows given flesh and malevolent purpose. From the cave mouth, Krog could see them flowing across the valley floor, not the disciplined advance of hunters, but the fluid movement of predators who had transcended normal human limitations through unspeakable practices. There were more than he had expected. Where Brack's force had numbered 20, this war party appeared to be twice that size. They moved in small groups that communicated through hand signals and bird calls, their coordination speaking to extensive experience in such raids. At their center walked a figure that made even Krog's battle-hardened spirit recoil. The blood hunter stood nearly as tall as Krog himself, but where the giant scars spoke of honest combat, this creature bore the marks of deliberate mutilation. Ritual cuts covered every inch of visible flesh, forming patterns that hurt to look upon. His teeth had indeed been filed to points, giving his smile a predatory quality that belonged more to beast than man. 40, at least, Krog reported quietly to Nala, who was making final preparations inside the cave. Too many for direct confrontation. Thane, somewhat recovered after a night of rest and healing, struggled to his feet. "You cannot fight them all. These are not hunters seeking glory. They are devourers who consume everything in their path. Then we make them pay such a price that they lose interest in consuming us," Krog replied grimly. Over the past hours, he had prepared every trick and trap that experience could suggest. The path to their cave was now a maze of hidden snares, concealed spikes, and carefully balanced stones. But he knew it would not be enough. A new sound drifted up from below, not the war cries they had expected, but something far more disturbing. The blood hunter was singing, his voice carrying an ancient melody that seemed to resonate in the bones of those who heard it. The words were in no language that Krog recognized, but their meaning was unmistakably threatening. "He calls to the darkness," Thane whispered, his face pale with recognition. "I heard this same song when they took my band. It does things to the mind, makes warriors freeze with fear, makes the weak surrender without fighting." Little Zara stirred restlessly in her sleeping furs, disturbed by sounds that her young mind could not understand, but instinctively feared. Nala quickly lifted the child, holding her close and humming a protective counter-melody that their own people had used for generations to ward off evil dreams. The singing stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that was somehow worse than the haunting melody. In that quiet, Krog could hear the raiders beginning their ascent, not the careful climb of normal hunters, but rapid movement that suggested they cared nothing for the traps that had been set. The first trap triggered with a crash of falling stones, but instead of screams of pain, there came only harsh laughter. Someone had been caught, but their companions seemed to view the injury as amusing rather than alarming. "They are not sane," Thane observed unnecessarily. "Pain means nothing to them. Fear means nothing. They have given up everything that makes us human in exchange for other things." More traps activated in quick succession. The sharp stakes, the hidden snares, the carefully placed obstacles that should have stopped or at least slowed any normal attack. But the sounds from below suggested that the raiders simply overwhelmed each obstacle through sheer numbers, leaving their wounded behind without concern. "They will reach us soon," Nala said. adjusting Zara's carrier so the child would be protected during what was to come. "What is your plan?" Krog hefted his largest stone axe, testing its weight and balance. "The same as always. Make them pay for every step, every breath, every moment they spend in our territory, and hope that survival is enough." But even as he spoke, they all knew this enemy was different. The Bloodhunters' raiders did not seek mere victory. They sought to break their opponents completely, to reduce them to quivering prey before beginning whatever twisted rituals gave their warband its power. The first raider appeared at the cliff top, just as the sun crested the eastern peaks. He was young, perhaps barely past his naming day, but his eyes held the flat emptiness of someone who had seen too much death. Ritual scars covered his arms and chest, and his smile revealed teeth filed to match those of his leader. Krog's thrown stone caught him in the center of the forehead, dropping him instantly. But before the body had finished falling, 2 more raiders appeared, then 4, then 8. They came without pause, without fear, without the normal human instinct for self-preservation. The battle that followed was unlike anything Krog had experienced. These enemies did not retreat when wounded, did not hesitate when their companions fell, did not show any of the tactical thinking that marked civilized warfare. They simply advanced, absorbing casualties like water soaking into sand, driven by something beyond normal human motivation. Nala fought beside him with desperate courage, her fire-hardened spear taking toll among the attackers. But for every raider that fell, 2 more seemed to appear. The narrow cave mouth that had been their advantage against Brack's disciplined hunters became a liability against enemies who cared nothing for their own lives. "The deep chamber!" Krog shouted over the sounds of combat. "Take Zara and fall back!" But before Nala could respond, a new voice cut through the chaos. The blood hunter himself, speaking in their own language but with an accent that made the familiar words sound alien and wrong. "Enough!" the scarred leader commanded, and his raiders immediately stepped back. "I would speak with the defenders before completing this dance." Krog kept his weapon raised, not trusting the sudden cessation of violence. Around them lay the bodies of perhaps a dozen raiders, but twice that number still crowded the cliff top, waiting with inhuman patience for their leader's next command. The blood hunter stepped forward, and Krog got his first clear look at their enemy. The ritual scarring was even worse up close, covering every inch of skin in patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the morning light. But it was the intelligence in those filed-tooth smile that was most disturbing. This creature was not mad, merely evil beyond normal human understanding. "You fight well, mountain giant," the blood hunter said conversationally. "Your female shows spirit, and the child, the child is perfect for our purposes. I offer you a choice." "Speak it," Krog replied, though he suspected he would not like what he heard. "Submit. Become part of my warband, and I will allow you to live as my lieutenant. Your family will be treated with consideration. Refuse, and I will take them anyway, but you will die slowly while watching what becomes of them." The offer hung in the air like poison smoke. Krog looked at Nala, at little Zara peeking out from her mother's protective embrace, at Thane standing ready to die for strangers who had shown him kindness. The choice was simple and impossible. "I have a counteroffer," Krog said finally. The bloodhunter's scarred face arranged itself into an expression of amusement. "Oh? And what might that be?" "Leave now, and I will let you keep whatever pieces of your warband can still walk." The laughter that followed was not entirely human. The bloodhunter's laughter died as quickly as it had begun, replaced by a cold fury that made the morning air seem to freeze around them. "You choose death then, mountain giant. So be it. But know that your defiance only makes what follows more educational." He raised his hand, and his remaining raiders began to advance once more, but this time something was different. The mindless rush was gone, replaced by the coordinated movement of predators who had decided to take their prey alive for purposes too terrible to contemplate. Krog stepped back into the cave mouth, forcing the attackers to come at him through the narrow opening. His stone axe swept in deadly arcs, each blow calculated to disable rather than kill quickly. But there were too many, and they kept coming, despite horrific casualties. Behind him, Nala had made her own decision. Instead of retreating to the deep chamber as Krog had commanded, she began the ancient fire song once again. But this time, she was not simply lighting a torch. This time, she was calling upon knowledge passed down from the eldest grandmothers, techniques that had been forbidden except in the most desperate circumstances. The fire that erupted from the cave mouth was not natural flame. Fed by oils extracted from rare plants, guided by breathwork that required perfect timing, it became a living thing that reached out to embrace the attackers with hungry tongues of destruction. The effect was immediate and devastating. Raiders who had shown no fear of death screamed and fled as the fire found them, their clothing and hair igniting in moments. Even the blood hunter staggered backward, his scarred face twisted with something that might have been genuine surprise. But Nala paid a price for wielding such power. The technique demanded everything she had, her strength, her breath, her very life force. She collapsed to her knees, gasping, as the flames began to die away. Krog saw her fall and felt something break inside his chest. With a roar that echoed off the canyon walls, he abandoned all caution and charged into the midst of his enemies. His axe became a whirlwind of destruction, cutting through the surviving raiders like grain before the harvest blade. The bloodhunter met his charge with weapons of his own, curved knives that dripped with substances that should not exist, wielded with skill that spoke of countless victims. The two giants clashed in the center of the burning cliff top, their battle taking on an almost mythical quality as fire and shadow danced around them. But it was little Zara who changed everything. The child had been watching the battle with the intense concentration she brought to everything, her young mind processing sights and sounds that would have driven adults to madness. And in that moment of ultimate crisis, when both her protectors seemed on the verge of defeat, she spoke a single word with perfect clarity. No, the sound that emerged from her tiny throat was not quite human. It carried harmonics that resonated in the bones, frequencies that made the very air seem to thicken and pulse with power. Every combatant on the clifftop froze as if turned to stone, weapons raised but unable to complete their deadly arcs. In the sudden silence, Zara toddled forward toward the bloodhunter, her small hands glowing with a light that had no earthly source. When she touched his scarred leg, the raider leader's expression changed from cruel confidence to absolute terror. "Impossible," he whispered, his filed teeth chattering like winter branches. "The old blood, it should have died out generations ago." Whatever power flowed through Zara's innocent touch, it stripped away the artificial strength that had made the bloodhunter and his followers more than human. The ritual scars that covered their bodies began to fade, the unnatural coordination that had made them so dangerous dissolved, and the evil intelligence that had driven them was replaced by confusion and fear. "Run," Zara said in her clear child's voice, and it was both command and mercy. "Go home. Be better." The surviving raiders needed no further encouragement. They fled down the cliff path like children running from nightmares, their leader stumbling after them with the broken gait of someone whose entire worldview had just crumbled to dust. When the last of them disappeared into the valley below, the strange light around Zara faded, and she collapsed into exhausted sleep. Krog caught her before she could hit the ground, his massive hands infinitely gentle as he cradled the child who had saved them all. "What is she?" Thane whispered in awe. Nala struggled to her feet, still weak from channeling the forbidden fire, but alive and whole. "She is our daughter," she said simply. "Whatever else she may be, she is ours to love and protect." The sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows of the night's terror. Around them the evidence of battle slowly faded, as wind and weather began their eternal work of erasure. But the bonds that had been forged in fire and blood would last for all the generations to come. In the months that followed, word spread throughout the scattered hunter-gatherer bands of the mountain valley. Stories were told around distant fires of the witch woman who commanded flame, the giant who fought like 10 men, and the child whose touch could drive away evil itself. Some tales grew in the telling, until they bore little resemblance to truth, but all carried the same essential message. This territory was protected by powers beyond normal understanding. Krog and Nala raised Zara with love tempered by wisdom, teaching her to use her gifts responsibly, while never forgetting that she was, first and always, simply their daughter. The child grew strong and healthy, learning the skills of both hunter and healer, developing into someone who could bridge the gap between the harsh realities of their world and the better future that might someday be possible. Thane remained with them, becoming first a guest, then a friend, and finally a member of their extended family. His wounds healed, and though he never forgot his lost daughter and mate, he found purpose in helping to protect others who might suffer similar fates. Other survivors began to find their way to the protected valley, refugees from raids, orphans from failed bands, healers and craftsmen seeking sanctuary from the growing chaos in the outer lands. Under Krog and Nala's guidance, a new kind of community began to form. Not the simple hunter-gatherer bands of old, but something larger and more sophisticated, bound together by shared purpose rather than mere blood kinship. As the seasons turned and little Zara grew from toddler to child to young woman, she became the heart of this new community. Her gift for sensing the true nature of people made her an invaluable judge of character, while her compassionate nature ensured that even the most desperate refugees found welcome in their protected valley. The cave that had begun as a simple shelter evolved into the center of a small but thriving settlement. New caves were carved from the living rock, connected by carefully constructed paths and bridges. Gardens were planted in the fertile soil of the valley floor, while herds of domesticated animals grazed in carefully tended pastures. And always, watching over it all, stood the two who had started it all, Krog the protector and Nala the fire singer, their love for each other and their adopted daughter serving as the foundation for everything they had built. In the end, their story became legend, passed down through generations of storytellers who would gather children around fires on cold winter nights. They would speak of the time when evil walked the earth in broad daylight, and how 3 souls, 2 brave and 1 innocent, stood against the darkness and drove it back. But for those who lived it, it was never legend. It was simply life, dangerous and beautiful, harsh and tender, filled with moments of terror balanced by seasons of joy. It was the story of what ordinary people could accomplish when they chose love over fear, protection over conquest, and hope over despair. And in the protected valley, where children grew up safe and strong, that story continued to unfold with each passing day, a testament to the power of family, the strength of determination, and the miracle of love finding a way to flourish even in the darkest of times. The dawn had come at last, and with it, the promise of better days ahead.